The Living History program at Duke University is very proud to present an interview with the Honorable Les Aspin, the Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecturer of 1995. Mr. Aspin presently chairs the Commission on the Roles and Capabilities of the United States Intelligence Community and is the holder of the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Aspin's distinguished career includes Chair of the President Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors, a member of Congress from Wisconsin for 22 years, Chair of the Armed Services Committee of the House of Representatives, and Secretary of Defense. He will be interviewed today by Tammy Biddle, lecturer in military history and the history of technology in the Department of History at Duke University, by James Miller, Professor James Miller of the Department of Public Policy Studies, Amoli Holsti of the Department of Political Science at Duke.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Secretary, I thought we might start this morning with a question that relates to intelligence, but also to your previous hat as Chair of the Armed Services Committee. Congressional Quarterly called your assessment of what would occur in the Gulf War stunningly accurate. The projection of how the war would take place, and indeed the projection of the number of casualties and fatalities. Also, I recall you were ahead of the curve on assessment relating to the demise of the Soviet Union. And I wonder, because you've used in this sense intelligence in your own work before, put it on your current hat as Chair of the Commission on the Future of Intelligence and as Chairman of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, if you could say a few words about those intelligence assessments.
Okay, I think that the thing that intelligence does is it looks at intelligence from the standpoint of one side of the equation only. I mean, the intelligence assessments are looking only at the red forces. They don't look at the blue forces. And where I think a lot of people make the mistake is when they take the CIA numbers without factoring in the dynamics of the situation and the fact that you've got blue forces playing the other side. And I think that has caused problems in the past, and it's going to cause problems in the future. Because when you ask the CIA to make an assessment, by law they are prohibited from analyzing the other forces, the American forces. Mm-hmm. So they're only analyzing it from the standpoint of the capabilities or the potential forces that they're going to look at. There's no net assessment. And what all of us are doing in the policy business are making a net assessment. So yes, we're listening to the CIA's assessment, but then we're also factoring in the forces on our side, the blue forces, and coming to some judgment, essentially a net assessment. So these international relations questions, which have such great implications, and a president has to make the policy judgments and everybody, they are net assessments. They're not really intelligence in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Could you say more specifically about your thinking during or leading up to the Gulf War, during the time of Desert Shield? The question was whether to go forward with the Desert Storm.
War. I mean, in that period, I mean, I think it was people were looking at it. The CIA was looking at it. I mean, I was told, very interesting, David Boren, who was the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, was unbelievably puzzled because what he saw during that build-up, he then went and asked the Intelligence Committee. He had access to intelligence information as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and got a very pessimistic assessment from the intelligence community about Desert Storm. And ultimately then he voted for continuing the sanctions in that important vote in January in both the House and the Senate. Mm-hmm. Since then, he keeps coming back to that question, and I have not heard him ask it myself, but people who have worked for him, Britt Snyder, who works for me, and George Tennant, who now works for Tony Lake, were staff members of me, said both of them have said to me that David Boren constantly says, you know, how could they have been so wrong? How could the agency have been so wrong about the capabilities of Iraq? You know, because they painted a much bleaker picture. The answer is that the agency is looking only at the red forces. What David's got to do, or anybody's got to do, is look at the blue forces and make a net assessment. I mean, that's what a president's got to do. That's what a voter has got to do, and that's what a commander has, somebody who's making a judgment. When I did it, we got involved. I mean, you know, you were in the Armed Services Committee staff at the time. We went and did the analysis and talked to the agency, got their assessment, which was, I assume, the same as David Boren's. It was pretty negative. But you know it's got to be a net assessment. So you're looking at the side, the blue forces side, and I thought that was. I mean, the analogy I've used is it's very much like a special election and a political judgment. I mean, a special election, you got a special election in the district. The congressman has died, and you've now got a special election going on, 2 candidates. Nothing else is going on, so a lot of attention to this race. The polls indicate, first of all, that the race is very tight between the 2 candidates. But there's a huge undecided, very large undecided, close, large undecided. Secondly, you look at the balance of contributions, and you've got pretty even. I mean, lots of money because it's a special election, nothing else going on, but pretty even. You look at visiting firemen going in, big names coming in on the Republican side, on the Democratic side. Again, it looks pretty even. So all the pundits are saying this is going to be a close race. So you go out as a politician, go out there because you're doing it for somebody to make an assessment. And you get out there and you kind of go around and get the feel of it. And you can only see one side, so your judgment is based upon only one side. So we're going to the Democratic side because we're Democrats. We got to find out what's going on in the Democratic Party. And you go with the candidate, and he goes to, you see him make speeches at the Rotary Club and the Union Hall and things. And you watch, and you see the candidates connecting. I mean, you can just see him connecting with his audience. You listen to the radio ads that he's got on and see the TV ads, and the message is zoning in there. I mean, it really is coming in. It's right on target. It's with the mood, and it's just at the right crossroads. You go to visit the campaign headquarters. People are busy. They're motivated. There's not a lot of sitting around drinking coffee. They know what they've got to do. They're not overconfident. They're not underconfident. They're right on the right edge. It's hit the right edge. And you come away, and one of the days, gradually as you watch this, you say, not only are we going to win this one, but we're going to blow them out. I mean, this thing is going to just come together, and all those undecideds are going to come our way, and we're going to just win. And yes, that's what happens. I mean, it's a feeling that comes from a net assessment as best you can put together. I came to a similar conclusion about the Gulf War, that I just have visited out there, talking to people, watching this equipment, saw the people who were running it, listening to them talk. They were up, they were leaning forward, they were confident, they weren't overconfident. And you put all of this together, and you saw what kind of a force they were planning and what they were going to do. You look at the blue forces, and you say, I don't care what the CIA says about the capabilities of the Iraqi forces. We're going to clean these guys' clock. And it was, and that's exactly what turned out. And the interesting thing is, I mean, there's a tendency in the intelligence business to assess people regardless almost of what they face. And that is never true. I mean, you see, the trouble is the CIA assesses the red forces. There's also the blue forces, but there's also the dynamic of the interaction. And I've always thought that the Iraqi forces were better than they looked. Now, it's a little bit like the old joke saying Wagner's music is better than it sounds. But the Iraqis were better than they looked. The reason they looked so bad is they were just so completely devastated by the nature of the attack. I mean, the attack was just massive, and it just rained on them and came out of the air, and they just didn't know where it was coming from, and it just demoralized them. It was such an attack. Contrast that to what we did in Vietnam, which was gradual escalation. And if gradual escalation, you end up with, you know, people getting immune to it. It builds up the immune. It's not easy. I'm not saying that living under those kind of attacks under any circumstance is easy, but it's, you can become immune to it, gradually get used to it, and you can tough it out. I think if you'd had a gradual escalation of the bombing campaign against Iraq, you'd have seen a much tougher Iraq than what we saw. Part of the reason why it was such a wipeout was the nature of the attack. So ultimately, the bottom line is there's the CIA's assessment of the Red Forces, there's your own assessment of the Blue Forces, and then there's the interaction that all go into putting this together in some kind of a net assessment. And what that means is you can't just call up the CIA and say, how will we do if we invade Haiti? Because they're only looking at part of the question.
As you did this net assessment, to what extent was this predicated on American air power superiority?
Totally, totally. I mean, it's essentially, that's the key of the whole thing. And ultimately, I mean, that's translatable into virtually every potential scenario now on the books. I mean, if you contemplate a war with North Korea, for example, which isn't much of a stretch, or some kind of a conflict with Iran or something, you know, the bad guys of the world, there's about a half a dozen of them where we might actually end up in conflict with them. In every case now, with the end of the Soviet Union, American air superiority is a given. And when you've got that, I mean, a whole bunch of things flow from that, including the ability to just totally have one of these saturation bombing. I mean, just like the skies opened up and kaboom, this whole thing comes down. And it's a terribly disorienting effect. And what you ended up with was Iraqis just really devastated by that. And so they were surrendering to UAVs, you know. I mean, they were trying to surrender to these little drones that were running around, you know, doing the spying, looking for them. They were so disoriented. Now, the Iraqi forces were not that bad. I'm sorry. I mean, they'd fought 8 years against Iran, etc., all of which the CIA pointed out in its estimates. Battle-hardened was what they said. This is a battle-hardened military. This is not a military that's been in garrison. This is a military that's been out fighting. Now, admittedly, Iran is not a Western, you know, not like fighting a major power, but still, they've been in battle. And so that's all went into kind of the CIA's assessment that this was not going to be a big pushover. The reason it was a pushover was just because of the nature of the campaign designed by the SINC, by Schwarzkopf and the folks in Washington and worked out in the plan. I mean, it was designed to disorient. I mean, it was designed, as they think about it, to get inside their decision cycle. I mean, all this stuff, you know, the business of disorienting, and it's better to disorient the enemy and have them surrender than to kill them. And, you know, that's a dynamic that predictions ahead of time can't do, but you have to try and come to grips with that if you're making a net assessment.
Mr. Secretary, I'd like to come back to the question of the Soviet Union. The years which saw the collapse of the Soviet Union are clearly going to go down as some of the most remarkable years of the 20th century. As someone who was in a central position in Washington through those years, would you comment on how much we really understood about, how much we anticipated those events and how much we really understood about them as they were ongoing?
Okay, I'm not sure that I know the answer to that question. It's one that I'm very interested in, and we're, as part of the commission that we're looking at, is to look at that question. How much did we know? I mean, this is not a net assessment. This is a pure intelligence estimate. And this is what you pay the CIA to provide you, or the intelligence community to provide you, is assessment of these kind of things. It's not clear to me to what extent, at this point, it's not, you know, in my analysis of the work here, it's not clear to me what we knew and what we didn't know, and who knew. But, I mean, the interesting thing is what we have here, just to back it up a little bit, what we have here is a new, with the end of the Cold War, which is the reason why we're doing this assessment of where we go with the intelligence community. But the end of the Cold War also gives us a good chance to assess what we knew about the intelligence community, because the records are opening. People who were around at the time are now willing to talk. And so it gives us a good opportunity to judge how well we were doing, we meaning the intelligence community, were doing in assessing what was going on in the Soviet Union. I mean, you can look at what the agency was saying in 1977, and then you can find out now what was really happening in 1977 by talking to the people, by looking at the records. So we've got some kind of a check. I think that, and one of the big questions is, did anybody see the end of the Soviet Union? The strains, the little strains of the evidence are the following. Number one, there were clearly people who saw, and this is, you know, we're now working through that question. At one level, there were people within the intelligence community who saw there was troubles in the Soviet economy. Okay. So they foresaw that there were some difficulties, and they were reporting it internally. It's not clear to me at this point how much that got reported out to the policymakers, but there were clearly people within the intelligence community who saw that the Soviet economy was in trouble, and they were talking about that from, I mean, mid-'80s on. I mean, they really saw that this was a big thing, and they were saying that Gorbachev was not going to be able to turn it around, that this thing was deeper than one man and deeper than the kind of shallow reforms that he was doing at the time. So there were people who saw that. I don't think any of them were saying that this is serious enough to rock the foundation of the whole operation. In other words, so far I have found nobody who was saying this is going to result, it's in such trouble that it's about to fall apart. I mean, zero in that set. Now, then there's the other question about how much of this was out in, you know, how much of this was transmitted out into the policy-making realm. Well, the CIA, as all of you know, I mean, it transmits in the intelligence community. There is no one single thing that transmits intelligence. I mean, there's a whole range of publications, and there's lots of conversations. So, you know, just because it isn't in the NIE doesn't mean it isn't conveyed in some other way. Or, so I'm still not clear to me what the role, how much of this concern over the economy that it was, how much was that translated to the academic community, I mean to the policy community. There's a third level of this thing, and that is the role of the leadership of the intelligence community. For a while, the leadership was skeptical of the new leadership in the Soviet Union, and was particularly, I think, rewriting the estimates. Now, you know, people were saying, well, you know, that's interfering with the estimate. Well, it's not interfering. I mean, these are the people who the president has appointed to be the head of the intelligence. And if they're the head of the intelligence, their job is to be the #1 advisor to the president and the policymakers as to what's going on. And so if they think if they have a different view than the analysts, their job is to convey their views. I mean, the question is always, how much do you convey of dissenting views within it and all that? I mean, so there's a third dimension to this thing, which I haven't sorted through. But, I mean, the bottom line is some people saw it. Nobody saw it as serious enough to cause a revolution. And it was being in this maelstrom of analysts at this level conflicting with the views of their bosses.
And one wonders even what Gorbachev might have understood as he was kicking over the first domino himself.
Very unlike, well, I mean, he certainly didn't understand the whole sequence. But I don't know that we know how much, you know, what was going on in his head or how he foresaw the events playing out. It would be interesting to try and talk to him as to what he saw. And I don't know, has anybody tried to do that? What about this Remick's book, the book by the Washington Post guy?
It's not really couched at the level of the leadership. It's couched more at the level of the informed public and the general public and so on. In other words,
okay, what they were thinking about this.
Right. He's not reporting of his sense of what's going on in the Kremlin.
Because I raised this, I mean, this was just bullshit general conversation at a dinner party, and somebody said, you ought to read this book, because maybe that does, I don't know whether you've read it.
It's a fascinating book, but it is a book which is not couched at
that level. Okay, well, then the question still stands, and I don't know the answer, and I don't know of anybody, maybe there is somebody who's done some work on it, but I mean, Gorbachev must have had in his mind something of how this thing was going to play out. And I don't know what.
How much
Let me just raise a sort of a question in another way. Is there, in your sense, has there been a kind of institutional bias toward seeing the Soviet Union as possibly more powerful and otherwise more threatening than perhaps that at least snippets of the evidence would suggest?
I think that's true, although I think that, I mean, my own view is that the Soviet was a huge and very serious military threat, and that there is now a revisionist going on, which is so typical of American opinion, that they are now flat on their back, and so there's a tendency to, they weren't that tough all along. I think that's not true. I mean, I think they were very tough. And I think my moral of the story is not looking how bad they are in Chechnya, that they, well, gee, then they probably weren't so good when we were scared of them. It's not true. I mean, I think that militaries are very fragile, and in a very short amount of time, a military can go from being absolutely #1 ace to being really not good at all. And then it takes a long, building up takes a long time. Coming down can be done very quickly. And so I think that that the attempt now to go back and say, because they are really a pretty ragged bunch now in 1995, that they weren't very good in 1985 is dead wrong. I think right up until, certainly till 1990, I don't know. I mean, I have to go back to reconstruct it as to when the things started to fall apart. But they were a formidable bunch.
Sure, even in our own history, the difference between 1945 and 1950.
Oh, big change. Yeah, there's
incredible.
an example. I mean, it's just huge change in capability. I mean, the military that dominated Japan and Germany was put much on the defensive by a North Korean military. I mean, good Lord.
It appears, listening to your responses to the questions about the Gulf War and then about the former Soviet Union, that there's a lot of political judgment involved in making these net assessments. And although you described the intelligence assessment or the aspect of the Soviet Union's intelligence, in fact, the balance of forces, Warsaw Pact versus NATO forces, was clearly an important part of the equation. And someplace where I recall William Webster came in with a somewhat different view than the previous Director of Central Intelligence, but a place that you pushed the intelligence agency in hearings and so on. And the question I'd like to ask is, how can we have, is this a judgment that has to take place only at the top? In other words, and how can the intelligence process feed that better? Are there elements of the, should we be looking more at the internal political dynamics on the other side, how does one judge the proper combination in making these assessments of economic factors, political factors, military capabilities? You've answered partly by saying it's a matter of judgment. And I'm thinking of the people not at your level but below you who think, what kind of information can I provide to the policymaker?
To do these net assessments?
Yes.
That you think about? Okay, like what would be another case other than the Gulf War, for example?
Well, thinking about the former Soviet Union, or take North Korea, take today's North Korea. What type of information? We know very little about Kim Jong-il.
Right.
We know very little about the internal dynamics, as far as I know, of the regime. We have reasonably good information about the sorry state of their economy.
Yes.
And prediction is quite difficult.
Yes.
How can a lower level person provide information that deals with that uncertainty?
This one is harder.
Way?
I mean, this one is harder. I mean, the main issue in the Korean issue is the question about what is it that they're trying. What are they doing by developing a nuclear capability? What are they trying to do? And there's lots of theories, but I mean, and the theories are all across the board. Theory number one is that they are developing nuclear weapons and they'll be willing to trade them. That what they'd be willing to do is trade them for economic help from Japan and diplomatic recognition by the United States. So it's some combination of diplomatic recognition and money and economic help, willing to trade it. Other people say no, that North Korea is developing this because they feel isolated. They feel it's kind of a doomsday machine. It's the last protection for them. They've lost their nuclear umbrella. Russia and China used to provide it. Russia is now totally unreliable. China is very, very unreliable as an ally for them in these things. So they feel they need to be able to threaten the other side with a nuclear weapon. They know they're not going to have more than a handful here, but a handful of nuclear weapons ought to protect them from being attacked in this modern world. It's a big equalizer. Nuclear weapons are a big equalizer. And they feel unequal at this point. They look out, they've lost their allies. They see the United States and South Korea allied against them in the South, and they need it for that. Another theory runs that this is a country that doesn't have any respect. Its economy is horrible. It's in a neighborhood in which economies are booming, Japan and South Korea, that if they could develop a nuclear weapon, it would give them some prestige, some standing, who knows? But on the base, and there's other theories, but on the basis of that theory is the policy. I mean, the policy has to be predicated on some theory. I mean, our policy is we want North Korea to not have nuclear weapons. The policy is a presupposition that they're willing to trade. I mean, that is it. I mean, it's based on an assessment that they're willing to trade this. So, I mean, is this a good deal? Well, it certainly would be a different assessment if it turns out to be that that's not what they're willing to trade. Ordinarily, you would enter into negotiations with a country to see, and if they sign the agreement, then you find out. I mean, if they sign the agreement, then that indicates that they are willing to trade. North Koreans are a little different in the sense that nothing is ever settled. And just because they sign a piece of paper, it doesn't mean anything. So it doesn't mean that they've agreed to trade. Some people will say they aren't going to trade it, they're just stalling for time, and then they're going to come back and violate the agreement and be back in the business of building nuclear weapons because they really want them. They don't want to trade them, they want them for some other thing. Well, so is this a good policy that the Clinton administration has? Only if the initial intelligence estimate is correct, which is that the North Koreans have been developing a nuclear capability, but they're willing to trade it. This
trade is a long time in the making, over the next 8 years.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes.
what can we do in the meantime? Shifting from intelligence to policy, are we
Well,
just have to
where we're really weak right now is having a policy choices in place for actions for the United States and its allies to do in the face of North Korean intransigence in carrying out the terms of the treaty. I mean, it's a given that even if in the end they were willing to trade, and even at the end they're going to follow the agreement that they've signed, that they're going to fight it every step of the way. And so every step of the way there's going to be some objection they're going to raise, something they're going to try and fight the proposition. If they do that, we need to have something that we're going to do on our side. What we're weak on right now is our only option is to pull out of the treaty. And the point is that they're not likely to give anything so dramatic as that would give us an excuse to go to our public and the world publics saying we got to pull out of this treaty. So what we need, and we need to work it with our allies, is an agreed step of countermeasures to short-term stalling and the kind of things that they're likely to do.
Let me turn to a slightly different area, which asked you to think a little bit about in your role as Secretary of Defense. As you, as a member of the Armed Services Committee, observed civil-military relations developing during the Reagan and Bush years and so on, what did you see, if anything, as important issues of civil and military relations as you began to prepare for your position as Secretary of Defense? And how did you try to cope?
Some examples. What would you think of?
Of examples of civil, essentially issues of civilian control of the military and so on. And I would raise questions of the, as you, I think at the time that you were getting ready to assume office, that there's some questions about whether General Powell, for example, was looking at issues in the same way as you were. There was the question as we got into the early days of your administration where General Powell took a somewhat different position on a number of issues and been rather publicly. And so these are the sorts of things
that he was different on the gaze in the military from the Clinton administration, but I mean, that was essentially his position from a previous incarnation. I mean, it was, his position was articulated during the Bush years because it came up in hearings, and he was asked about it, and he responded in a way that indicated that he was very skeptical about whether there was a way in which you could have gays serving in the United States military and still have an effective military force. And that was his view. It was still his view when Bill Clinton took office, having made some other statements during the campaign. So what you had was that General Powell was really faced with statements that were made in a previous administration, but which were consistent with that administration's policy, now serving under a fixed term arrangement in a new administration with which had a very different view on that policy.
Are you saying then that aside from possibly that one issue that you didn't really see any major problems as you moved into the Pentagon?
I mean, there's always differences of opinion and differences. It's an ongoing kind of turmoil of policy choices and decisions and whatnot. But I mean, I think that was the only one that was so public, where Colin Powell was out publicly in a position that was contrary to the Clinton administration's position. And as I say, I mean, it was the fact that a different president got elected in the middle of his, or during his term, and so you had a different policy. I mean, so I think that was the most visible, and I think that was the one that was the one that was when people, as you say, there was public differences. That would have been it. His general attitude towards the use of military assets in combating these situations was pretty skeptical, but indeed it was the whole military's attitude was skeptical. But during his term in office, we never did do anything that was different from what we inherited from George Bush. I mean, we were doing Somalia, but George Bush got us into Somalia. We didn't do Bosnia. Colin Powell didn't want to do Bosnia, but Bill Clinton still hasn't done Bosnia. Haiti, yes, but that came up after Colin had left office. So, I mean, you know, his position on issues were, you know, articulated within the administration. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't blame him for that. I mean, I think that was what you want is a person who will give the president what their views are, that they will not make life difficult for the president by undercutting him in public, and I thought it was honestly played.
Goldwater-Nichols, to return to that question, it seems to have greatly strengthened the joint staff.
Very definitely.
And this was perhaps one of the most dramatic reflections of that. What has that done? When you have particularly when you have a turnover of civilians just after an election, what has that done to the ability of the secretary to run the department, especially immediately after a transition, is the situation that you faced?
Well, I mean, you've got the joint staff has, first of all, you're right, the quality of people on the joint staff is much higher. And that is due mainly to Goldwater-Nichols, which now mandates tours and joint duty tours before you get to be admiral or general. That has changed the dynamic tremendously in terms of the quality of people on the joint staff. When I was in the Pentagon in the 60s, the quality of the joint staff was not very high, and mainly because the best people didn't want to do duty there. The best way to get to admiral was continual Navy assignments, and particularly a lot at sea. And the best way is similarly in the other services. What Goldwater-Nichols did was to change the calculation of able and ambitious officers, that their career paths changed. I mean, they had to go and do joint assignments, so all of a sudden work on the joint staff, being one of, not the only joint assignment, but one of the joint assignments, was in fact the plum joint assignment. So all of a sudden you changed the calculation, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs then had a choice of the best people in the United States military. It also had the advantage of its ongoing nature. I mean, its continuity. I mean, there may be changes in the chairman of the joint staff, but the joint staff changes, not like the changes that occur in the civilian side when there's wholesale changes of assistant secretaries and everybody else at the change of administrations. So that was already there, but you add down the quality factor. The second thing is that the quality of the people in OSD is not as high as it used to be in the 1960s. And the reason of that is legislation that prevents revolving doors. That we have now got, in the old days, when I was there in the 60s, when Bob McNamara was Secretary of Defense, we used to be able to attract people to come to work in the Pentagon, in the OSD office, systems analysis, where I was, now PA&E, or the comptroller's office, or any one of a number of these offices. You get good quality people who would come for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. They'd come in, they'd do that, and then they'd go back to what they were doing. The revolving door legislation prevents them from going back to what they were doing. So they don't come in the first place. I mean, they say, thank you very much, but, you know, I can't go back to Martin Marietta or McDonnell Douglas or whatever I was working on if I come work for you guys. You know, I have 5 years or 3 years or whatever it is, that I can't go back in that business, sorry, I'm going to stay in industry. You're forcing people, civilians, to choose between a private life career and a public life. You're preventing the back and forth that we used to have. Well, when you do that, the quality people choose private life, or at least a lot more do. Now, I'm not saying that the people there aren't good, but the pool that you choose from is less able than the pool that was there in the 1960s. So, I mean, the joint staff has gotten better, and the civilian staff has gotten less able.
So where does civilian control come from if you think of the political appointees on down the level of
the what?
Where does the political control, the civilian control
nobody doubts that civilian control is not the right term, because nobody doubts that the civilians check the boxes. All right, the boxes ultimately you check Secretary of Defense or the President or somebody. I mean, it's a civilian that checks the boxes. But what you have, I mean, Colin and Powell used to say, you, meaning me or the Secretary of Defense, ought to look on the joint staff as your staff. You know, in other words, we'll develop options for you. We'll do, and they would be good, and they would be good options. But they were put together by the military. I mean, in other words, and yes, I would make the choices among the options presented by the military. What you would want would be an OSD who would give you their view on the options, perhaps develop some options of their own, so that you had a wider look of views. So it's not civilian control. Control is there. It's civilian development of the options, civilian development of the thinking.
Mr. Secretary, when one undertakes a comprehensive evaluation of American policy, like the bottom-up review, to what extent is one really free and able to follow what the analysis says? And to what extent does one have to anticipate ahead of time the potential bureaucratic frictions, bureaucratic resistance that might result from that analysis as you're in the midst of the process?
Give me some examples. What are we thinking about here?
Well, if we're talking about 1.5 wars, the Air Force might like that because they see themselves as doing the whole half war and maybe part of the other one war. But the Army might resist it because they might feel like they're being cut out of the process. How does one try to anticipate that, and do you have to play off the bureaucratic politics against
I mean,
not
that one. I mean, that one is determined more by the political policy of what's saleable. And basically, we came up with 2 MRCs more or less simultaneously, I think nearly simultaneously. I mean, we rejected the idea of a 1.5 win, hold, win, mainly because it would have run into, I think, just difficulty in the public mind.
Okay, so it was more the public
Yep,
concern.
and you could see that they were, you know, we tried a trial balloon on the idea, and the Republicans came at it, and so we said, let's not do that. I mean, we were debating whether in fact we ought to do it, but we thought, let's try and see what the public reaction is. The public reaction was not very good. And I think that for good reasons that we've had some problem with in the past. I mean, I think in the past they played around with the notion of swing forces, you know, forces that would fight in one contingency and then be loaded up and swung over the other. Well, outside of Air Force, their swinging forces doesn't. You can swing Air Forces pretty readily, but I don't think you can swing ground forces. And
they have to be trained for a particular scenario.
Well, and once they're there, I mean, you know, to pull them out of fighting in the desert and stick them into Korea or something would be without going through some kind of a recycling on the training would be tough.
So you were anticipating, but it was more at the public level and the political level than
now, in that case, I mean, if you can think of another one, maybe there would be a bureaucratic, but no, that was the one that was at the public level.
When you're in a general era of level or declining budgets. Budgets seem to be often issues that create some bureaucratic frictions. And you, of course, while you were in the Pentagon, that described the situation. Did the prospect of declining budgets create bureaucratic difficulties, inter-service rivalries?
Yeah, and of course, a huge interest in the bottom-up review. But I mean, that was the purpose of having the bottom-up review, was to fight it all out ahead of time of where we were headed, so that you didn't have these fights annually. I mean, you know, you had a goal that you knew you were going toward, and indeed, once they had that goal and the services saw that that's where they were going to, they were more likely to commit to cut excess forces from that to get money to build the other stuff that they needed. I mean, you know, that's why what you need is where you're going, to know where you're going. If nobody knows where you're going, everybody resists all the cuts all the way down. If you know where you're going, then the service, and they believe that's where you're going to, then what the service does is they say, oh, okay, I know where I've got to go to. And they actually would probably volunteer some early retirements, some base closings up here in order to get the money to buy into other stuff they need. In other words, to get to here, they would, instead of just going like this, they'd go down faster and come across.
Well, in prior, I'd like to push that a little bit further, because in prior eras when we went through declining defense budgets, in the Truman administration, for example, we had the revolt of the admirals. During
Right.
the Eisenhower administration, we had the revolt of the generals. And what you're saying is essentially that we've been able to avoid that by being able to project long-term goals, and that the military...
Well, I'm not enough familiar with how they were approaching it politically at the time of the revolt of these cuts in those era. But what we tried to do was to establish some notion of where this thing was headed for, and build a long-term consensus around what you needed for the long term to defend the United States in the post-Cold War era, and get some idea on that, and to avoid the inter-service fights at every point along the way, by saying, okay, you know, when we know where we're going, now you guys tell us how you want to get there. You, the Army, and you, the Navy. Mm-hmm. Tell us what, you know, okay, we've agreed on the bottom-up review that this is where it's going to go.
How did you get that kind of consensus? How did you get
just a lot of talking, a lot of talking.
So you were seeing a willingness to say this is what the nation needs, and
yeah.
we'll move in that direction, and we'll move in that direction together as three separate services, but oriented towards a common goal.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I don't think there was a big. I mean, I don't think there was a big fight over. I mean, you know, and we're doing it now, and we're ending up with a Roles and Missions Commission in the military that's re-looking at some of these issues. But I mean, it didn't seem to me that there was the same kinds of. You guys would know better about these historical cases. I mean,
certainly with the revolt of the admirals, it was sort of a straight trade-off between do you build more bombers or do you build carriers?
Right. Usually it's at the core, that kind of a core fight. Mm-hmm. And not to say that there isn't that kind of tension now. I mean, there's large numbers of those trade-offs where they cross service lines, where people have some big stakes in it. Mm-hmm. But it was handled, I mean, it was, you know, worked and talked out and dealt with in a way that...
The very rigid lines didn't have a chance to develop in the same way.
And didn't have a fight.
Mm-hmm.
You talked earlier, and this relates to this question about the military as being a fragile, possibly fragile because of the importance of morale and readiness. Mm-hmm. I wondered, relating to that question, what do you see as a long-term history of gays in the military, which which was posed largely as a question of morale for the other troops.
Mm-hmm.
Are we is don't ask, don't tell a stable policy? Will we see it change over time? How does that play out?
I mean, I think it's not the last word, but I don't think you'll see it changed anytime very soon. Now, I'm assuming that it will withstand the challenges in the courts. I mean, I may be surprised by that, but I think it'll withstand the challenges in the courts. Because the courts have traditionally given the services a pretty wide latitude to do things because of the unique nature of military life, to do things that they would find objectionable if any other institution tried to do them. I mean, the courts, I mean, the military regulates people in ways that the court would find intolerable if it were another institution. Everything from telling people how their hair should be cut to severe limitations on freedom of speech if you're in the military. Mm-hmm. Now, the court would not allow any other institution to do that, but the court has traditionally said that this is a military, and a military is different. It's people's lives are at stake. That they give them a large degree of latitude of things that they feel are necessary to instill discipline and teamwork and things to protect Americans' lives. Mm-hmm. Plus, it's a voluntary organization. I mean, if you don't like it, you can leave. I mean, it's not a draft anymore, and the courts have said that's different. You know, I mean, if this was a draft, we might take a different view of some of these restrictions that the military is proposing, grabbing people and then restricting their life. But it's a voluntary organization. If you find the restrictions intolerable, there's no reason to stay. Mm-hmm. So, plus that this policy now is a policy that has gotten broad approval of the government. And the second reason I think the courts will support it is that it has broad support of the policymakers. The previous policy was just kind of was implemented or adopted without a lot of debate or discussion, and with certainly no votes in Congress. It was just done that way. This new policy was thoroughly debated within the administration, supported by all of the service, the chairman of Joint Chiefs, the leadership of the Pentagon, and voted on in Congress and passed by 2-to-1 vote in both houses of Congress. Mm-hmm. And signed by the president in the authorization bill of that year. So, I mean, the courts now have this policy which was adopted openly and after thorough debate mm-hmm. by the executive branch and by the legislative branch. For those reasons, I think in the end, the courts will leave the policy and will not overturn it, but we'll see. Assuming that is the case, my prediction is that in another half a dozen years or so, the issue will come up again and it'll be changed. It's an evolving policy, mm-hmm. as indeed the public's attitudes about homosexuality is evolving. And the military is neither going to lead nor lag the general development of thinking on that subject in the society. It's unlikely to lead because there's a general feeling that it should not be a place for experimentation, for policy experimentation, for social experimentation, that the military is too important an institution for the security of the country mm-hmm. to be chosen as a guinea pig to try out policies. So therefore it's not going to be a leader on the leading edge, but because it's also representative of American society, it's not going to be lagging by very much. So it's going to be within the zone of what Americans generally think is the right attitude towards homosexuality. If that's the case, then I would expect that over the next 10 years, America's views on gays and homosexuality will evolve. And when that happens, there'll be a change in the policy.
Mr. Secretary, in recent decades, we've seen a radical transformation of the role of women in society, and that transformation is now beginning to affect the armed services as we see women coming into true combat-oriented positions. Yet that transformation has not come without resistance. What do you think is at the root of that resistance? How long do you think it will take for it to fade? And how will future generations think about women in the military, women in combat roles? Will that eventually become a normal thing, an expected thing?
My feeling is that in the long run it ends up with as much gender neutrality as possible, that you associate different positions with the requirements of that position. And if there's some physical characteristics that are necessary for that position, that will become the standard. And if that's the case, some standards for some positions may be ones that very few, if any, women can qualify for. Ground combat troops, if you decide that for an effective ground combat troops that they need to have certain kinds of upper body strength and ability to carry a pack of so much weight and run so many yards in so much amount of time, and these kinds of things that are necessary, I mean, then they ought to be standards. If you can prove that that kind of standard is important, I mean, we're talking about people's lives at stake here, that in order to make sure that you minimize casualties and develop the necessary skills in your forces to be able to protect themselves, that these are what is really required, then they ought to be written into the standards, even though those kind of standards would discriminate against women generally. Other skills would not be. I mean, if you had the skills to fly an airplane, would be a different set of skills. Eyesight, probably 20/20 eyesight, and good hand-eye coordination. Those ought to be designated for pilots, and those would not discriminate against women. But the standards ought to be written to apply to the job, not to accommodate or to discriminate against people by gender.
Okay. If you come up with a core group of women who would be qualified for ground combat, are there other problems associated with ground combat as a unique
we're not
activity?
yet at ground combat. I don't know. I mean, there are other there are other practical matters that might impinge on it. Submarines, for example, women are now allowed on warships, so they're allowed on aircraft carriers. They're not allowed on submarines. Practical matter is that there just is not enough room on submarines to develop separate facilities for two genders. I suppose you could have an all-woman crew, but the problem is that basically the military is attractive to only a certain set of women, and 80% of the military, even if it were totally open and no barriers at all, 80% of the military would be male. So as a practical matter, if you're going to have one gender running a submarine, it's going to be males. And there isn't room on a submarine to have more than one facilities for more than one gender. There is on an aircraft carrier, and so women are serving on an aircraft carrier. So there are, yes, the answer is there are other considerations other than just physical capability of doing the job that will impinge on certain on certain parts of this. So
we'll proceed basically pragmatically according to
Well, it's pretty much what has been doing, is proceeding pragmatically, yes.
Does a point come where, for example, ground combat might well include serving in tank crews and so on?
Yep.
Does a point come where the concern about women casualties become a constraint?
No, I think that's what that's what's overcoming. I mean, I think that what has in the past, the notion that women casualties, that it was not proper for a military to allow to have women getting killed in combat. I mean, I think we're gradually getting used to the notion excuse me, that women could serve in combat and could be be casualties. I mean, partly that's happening because the old distinction was shown to not be very meaningful. The idea that women could serve behind the lines as supply and medical help, but not in the front lines as combat. But the notion that the behind the lines was safe and all the killing occurred in the combat zone has never been true. And there's a lot of casualties in the rear, and women got killed. But they weren't put in the direct line of fire as such. But, I mean, I think that's that's the barrier that is being broken down here gradually. The notion that by just practical experience, the notion that there is some kind of a line at which it's safe if you're behind here, but not safe if you're in front of it.
Let me pick up on a related point, and this is it comes out from your talk last night. And there's a cluster of things. The general willingness of the American public to take casualties in various kinds of undertakings. You talked about the CNN effect. You talked about the constraining role of public opinion. CNN isn't going to go away. The Gallup polls aren't going to go away. What are the prospects of being able to conduct effective foreign and defense policies in an era where instantaneous communications and demand for instantaneous information increases?
Problem. It's a huge, huge problem. And the main thing is, the main problem is that it's shortened the response time that you have.
So how do we deal with that?
You just learn to live with it. I mean, unless people can learn to live with and no comment. I mean, George Stephanopoulos, and I'd have to get the exact example because he laid it out in some detail, but he was talking about how when the Berlin Wall went up, do you remember this thing? He talked about the Berlin Wall going up, and that at that time the pictures of the Russians building the Berlin Wall had to be flown back. I mean, the film was taken, they had to fly them back, and it was 72 hours before the American public saw the Berlin Wall being built on TV. So by that time, the Kennedy administration had to have a response, but they had 72 hours to figure out what they were going to say, what their response was going to be. CNN now, it's going to be on within half an hour. And there's news cycle, and you're going to have to, and in those days, you had to respond once a day, really, because in the late afternoon, where you dealt with the evening news and the next morning's newspapers. So there was one news cycle that was critical, which was about 5 o'clock, Washington time, for the evening news and for the next morning's paper. Now there's continuous news cycles. It's a constant flow, and shortened and short. I mean, you would not have 72 hours now at a comparable case of trying to decide what your policy was. You wouldn't have half an hour.
What are the implications of that for the quality of how we can react?
Your imagination's as good as mine. It's not very good.
Will the American people accept the answer, we don't have a comment right now, information is coming in, we're deciding, we're making decisions about how to proceed next? Is that something that we can say to the American people, and can they get used to that and live with that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the answer, you'd have to ask a newspaper, I mean, a media people, but my guess is if the administration said that, the media would go out and find somebody to fill that gap. There'd be a senator or a congressman or a think tank expert or somebody who'd be willing to.
So even if it's in the best interest in the country to not say anything just yet, there'll
be lots of people who will say something.
Let me follow up on a more general aspect of this question: the American public's willingness to accept casualties. What does it say? Not just the CNN factor, but over time, what does that say about our ability to engage in humanitarian activities when there's some risk to human life, to our soldiers' lives, as there almost always is?
Yeah, I think that means it's very difficult to conduct these humanitarian efforts, because I think if casualties are there, American public will want to change and want to leave, want to get out.
Mm-hmm.
There are those who think that the current Americans' attitude towards war is such that they can't take casualties no matter what the reason for fighting the war is. But I mean, I still believe that if the people have an idea that this is somehow for America's security, certainly, even if it's for America's interests, that they would be willing to accept the notion that we will accept casualties if that is what we're trying to do. So I think that the Somali experience does not mean necessarily that we would not accept casualties on something that was in our interests. But I do think anything that's involved with values or humanitarian effort, it's going to be very hard to continue a policy where Americans are getting killed.
Is there a danger in continuing these dangerous humanitarian operations that over time the American public could shift, in your view, to the other view that says we're not going to accept any casualties for interests, even if our interests are directly at stake?
I don't know. Maybe. Why? What were you thinking? You mean just that they would get used to the idea that we don't do anything if we have casualties?
Yeah. Basically, that an analogy to the, if you will, to the Vietnam syndrome, which is a little bit different, but a few cases of humanitarian interventions that go very bad, and a mixing in the minds of the public of those with all military operations. Meaning that might be, and this argument's been put forward, maybe more difficult to intervene in cases where where national security interests are more directly at stake. A situation that North Korea could develop into over time, Iraq, Iran, that you mentioned before.
Possible.
Does this put a much greater burden then on the administration to try to level with the American public and try to explain rather clearly why American interests are involved? And do you think recent administrations have done a good job with that, with respect to that?
No, I don't know that they have done a particular. I mean, I don't think the Bush administration did a very good job of explaining our interests in the Desert Storm, frankly. But I think the poll showed that the American public did sense that our interests were at stake in Desert Storm. In a way that they weren't in other cases, and I mean that's a pretty good bedrock. If people think that our interests are engaged, that's a good bedrock. But I mean, administrations traditionally have not been very good at articulating the stakes.
Why do you think that's the case?
Oh, I don't know. I think that they get, I think it's just internal turmoil and policy made on the run and not thought through and not thought through what they were going to try and do.
Is there a fear to go out to the public and say, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it? Is there a concern that the popular wisdom won't comprehend? Or
I don't know. I mean, I don't have any particular insight into it. I mean, you'd have to ask the Bush administration what was going on and whether there was any internal discussion among themselves as to how they were going to present this case. But, they tried a lot of things. I mean, George Bush claiming he was like Adolf Hitler. Saddam Hussein was like Adolf Hitler. Jim Baker's cry of jobs, jobs, jobs. I mean, there's just a lot of false starts.
But they were polling every night, trying to see what the public would react to, and it turns out that the public would react mostly to the possibility that Iraq would have a nuclear program.
Exactly right. I mean, that one showed, and then of course they ran that policy and was loudly hooted at by the intellectual press, and of course they turned out to be right and the intellectual press wrong. Saddam Hussein was pretty close to a nuclear weapon, and in fact that was a very good reason. So the irony of the whole situation is compounded, that what the public would have believed, the elite dumped on And so it was never articulated, but in fact it was true.
But doesn't that, just to be the devil's advocate for a moment, doesn't that suggest the possibility that, in fact, administrations ought to put a good deal of effort into trying to level with the public and try to explain and to build the kind of public support that, that might be necessary? It seems to me, if one could make the argument that during the Truman administration, although Harry Truman was not a public relations master, and yet on major undertakings, the Marshall Plan, NATO, and so on, the administration did a rather good job of persuading the public that these things, these quite revolutionary changes, were in the national interest.
Yeah, and of course all this adoration of Harry Truman is pretty much in retrospect.
Right.
At the time, Harry Truman was more unpopular than Bill Clinton. So I mean, I don't know what to say. I don't know, in other words, I don't know enough about the Truman administration to know what strategy they did adopt to get NATO and Marshall Plan votes. I mean, I know, I guess a big part of that was developing a couple of Republicans who would...
Reliance on Vandenberg in particular.
And in the Vandenberg in the Senate, and also, I guess, Republicans around the country who were not in Congress, but were respected figures in the Republican Party. I mean, I think it was a kind of a traditional coalition building.
Why have in recent years have administrations been, since Vietnam, really quite unsuccessful in building a bipartisan coalition?
Well, I mean, I think the whole notion that differences stop at the water's edge is no longer the case, and has not been since. I mean, Vietnam ended that, and you now have a big difficulty in putting together a foreign policy just like domestic policy. It's essentially, there, in the minds of modern legislators, there is not a distinction. There's not a difference. There's not a deference to the executive branch. There's not a feeling that bipartisanship ought to be the rule.
Let me give you, let me ask a question, but preface it with the observation. When Kennedy won the 1960 election with a very, very small plurality of the vote, he reached out to the Republican Party and gave both the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury positions to distinguished Republicans. Earlier, Franklin Roosevelt had done this in 1940 to try to fire his Secretary of Navy and Army and brought in distinguished Republicans. Was there any thought when Bill Clinton won the election with 43% of the vote that there should be a reaching out to some distinguished Republicans, say Senator Lugar or others, and try to build this kind of a coalition?
I mean, I'm not the right person to ask. I mean, I was not privy to the discussions, so I can't speak. I honestly don't know. But it's a different mood now. I mean, you can't buy the Republican Party with a couple of slots any more than you can buy the Democratic Party. I mean, suppose Richard Lugar was in the Clinton cabinet, how would that affect Newt Gingrich? My guess is not at all. Not at all. Not at all. In fact, you could appoint the whole Republican establishment. I mean, Newt's a rebel, and you know he is unimpressed by establishments generally, Democratic establishments particularly, but Republican establishments just as well. I mean, he is no, because Alan Greenspan says it, doesn't mean Newt Gingrich believes it. And Alan Greenspan's as Republican as they come.
The ramifications, though, of this high level of animosity are frightening to me. I mean, if I look down the road and I think to myself, boy, we really can't get a consensus over any issue that really involves serious American interests, that's a world that worries me.
It's a different. I mean, it's a whole. This goes beyond foreign policy. It's across the board. But I mean, it's the current mood. that the country is going through.
Is there anything that might swing us back, or can you think of
I
a...
have no idea. Time will do it. But
If I could follow that and turn away from defense for a moment, you were in the White House, Council of Economic Advisors, then in the Pentagon, then 22 years in Congress, and 8 of which were as committee chair of the House Armed Services Committee, now back for the last several years in the administration as secretary and in your current roles. And this question is about the relationship between the executive, between the White House and the administration, and Congress on the other hand. 2 issues are currently, as it turns out, under discussion today. One is term limits in the House, several different variants. Doesn't look like it's going to pass this time around. But I wondered if I could ask you about that, and also about the line item veto, which does look like it's going to go forward in a modified form relative to what we saw even a few weeks ago.
I thought, I mean, I was not in favor of either. I think that the term limits whenever you do any of these reforms, you do accomplish what you set out to, but there's always unintended results. And I think the potential of unintended results in the term limits and in the line item veto are essentially pretty large. I think if you had a term limits, what that means is that the focus of power will shift away from members of Congress to staffs, to committee staffs, of course, not member staffs. Those will change with the member. But the staffs of committees will then be the longest serving body, and you will have a succession of chairmen. You know, if you have a term limits, presumably that it will have an effect on the meaning that somebody will not be chairman of a committee more than a couple of terms. That kind of turnover will change the nature of institutions and committees in Congress. I mean, right now they are the creature of the chairman. I mean, they're built in his image, his or her image. They're women chairman. They build their own staff and their own personalities and others into the staff. They are at least elected by somebody. What you will probably develop is committees that will be beholden to the chief of staff. They will become a permanent feature there. And what it will do would be it will become like the Veterans Organization. The ostensible head of the Veterans Organization is the commander who serves for 1 year. You know, it's a system in the Veterans Organization where the national commander serves for 1 year, and then but you get there by starting out about 8 years before with a lower position and move up, and then you become second vice commander, and then first vice commander, and then commander. You move through sergeant at arms, and it's an organization. They are the ostensible leader of those organizations, but in fact they are not, because they're not there long enough. The real power is the executive director, and the commander of the Veterans Organization spends his time in office traveling, going to the annual D-Day ceremony and the annual ceremony and this and this and this. The guy who's back in the office who runs it is the executive director. So if you want to cut a deal on veterans legislation and you're a congressman, you know, don't worry about the guy who's over at the D-Day ceremonies. Get the guy who's at the office, who runs the staff, who's there year in and year out, who runs the organization, who writes the newsletter. The other guy signs it, but who really runs it. That's the real power. And that's what you're going to have in Congress. I mean, you're essentially going to have committee chief of staffs who will run the committee. This is certainly not what they intend with term limits, but my guess is that's what'll happen. Secondly is this notion that the reason people are not responsive, somehow notion that they're not responsive, they're responsive more to the special interests than they are to the public, is behind this, that people get elected and then they be responsive to special interests and then they get money from the special interests and that perpetuates themselves in office. So the longer they're there, the more responsive they are to the special interests. So the term limits is to make them less responsive, in other words, make the public, the officials, not responsive to the special interests. My guess is that you have term limits and you're going to have them very responsive to the special interest, because people automatically then will start thinking about, once they get elected, they're going to have, let's say they have 6 years or 12 years or something in between, whatever it is. They're going to have to start thinking, what am I going to do when I'm going to leave? And what do most congressmen do when they leave? They become lobbyists. Well, who do you become a lobbyist for? You got to be nice to them so that they'll hire you as a lobbyist when your term is up. So, I mean, people will be feathering their nest for their post-Congress career very early. And you're going to find that, in fact, they're not less dependent upon special interests. They're going to be more dependent on special interests.
One of the things you mentioned in your analogy was the idea of the supposed representative being away from home base and someone else running the show. Is that an argument for longer terms for House members now, rather than a 2-year term? Because going back to the district, it's a continual really re-election campaign, but 1 year out of 2, for anyone with a close race at all, which many have now, is a pretty intense experience. Is that an argument for longer terms?
It might be, but I don't think there's any chance in the current mood of that. But I think that as a practical matter, most congressmen do not face a serious challenge every 2 years. I mean, although you're running every 2 years, you would face a really serious challenge maybe 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 elections. I mean,
your first election and then...
And then every once in a while, somebody will come along and make it a real race. And presumably, if they come close, then they sense a vulnerability and they might come back again, or a good candidate. If you have what's perceived to be a not very good candidate and you don't win by a very big margin, then people sense that there's a vulnerability, and then they run a really good candidate with good finance backing against a opponent. So, but basically, I think if you had a seat, now some people by fluke get elected to a seat that's very improbable, a Democrat getting elected to a heavily Republican seat, district, or vice versa, in which case, I mean, life is one continuous campaign. And I don't think you can survive just doing that very long. I mean, it just wears you out. I mean, you just roll out of one campaign and you get into another just in order to stay in office, because your existence there at all was improbable. And, you can never, because the district is so stacked against you, you can never get comfortable. And if that's the case, I mean, I think it is. It's just too hard to stay. I mean, I think that's what happened to Ab Mikva, for example. I don't know if, the current counsel of he was a congressman. He represented a Democratic district, and then in one of those redistricting in Illinois, he found himself essentially in a Republican district. And he fought like mad and got back in, and he'd fight like mad again and get back in. We just got tired because, he never did lose, but it was a cliffhanger every year, and it was continuous campaign. I mean, it wasn't every other year. He was campaigning all the time. And it really, spending all his time campaigning instead of doing what legislators are supposed to do. So he eventually accepted a judgeship and said, I'm worn out here. I can't do this. But that's the real exception. Most situations are such that if you're there, you get a challenge every once in a while. And that makes it tolerable. I mean, you really, in the years when you don't have that serious a challenge, it doesn't take that much effort. And so it's livable.
If I could follow up on the line item veto, because it looks like we will see that enacted. How is that going to play out over time, and particularly the relative power between the Congress and the President?
Well, what it means is it gives the President a big negotiating leverage.
Some have argued that that might not reduce the budget after all, that it's going to be used. Is that your view?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just a question of who do you cut the deal with in order to get your whatever it is that you're trying to get in there. I mean, a new National Guard armory, okay? It's in there, and in the past you had to cut the deal with the relevant committees and the chairman. So you had to do it in the authorizing committee, the appropriations committee, and you had to make sure that they protected it in conference, et cetera. So there was a number of people you had to deal with. What you now have to deal with is you have not only those sets of people, but you have to deal with the White House. And the White House then will say, look, you know, if you want to vote, you got to vote our way on certain things, and you know we won't line item out your National Guard armory. I mean, it's a little ironic that Newt's about to give a Democratic president this huge amount of authority, which will not be used to eliminate the pork, but will be used that keeping the pork in will cause congressmen to vote for major issues that Bill Clinton wants. I mean, the bottom line is Bill Clinton doesn't care about the National Guard armory. He cares about his welfare reform bill. So the deal is, so you come in saying, you know, I really need this National Guard armory. It's very important for my reelection. And we want you to not do a line item veto on it. And the White House says, well, you know what's important to us, this vote coming up on the budget or the...
But why is a Congress which, particularly it's been said that particularly in the post-Vietnam years, has become increasingly jealous of its prerogatives, why is it, aside from Newt and so on, that a Congress is willing to give the executive that kind of...
Because they got it in this contract. I mean, the public doesn't understand the interplay between the budget. They do believe that there's fat in the budget that's put there by Congress. They believe that that a president's going to knock it out because the president, either he's Democrat or Republican, is not part of that system. What they don't realize is that presidents in most cases are not going to knock it out, but they're going to use it as leverage to keep the congressman who wants it in line on other votes, on other major votes.
Is that power then taken almost directly away from committee chairs?
Well, yes. I mean, but you know, it was not a single deal because you had to get it appropriated as well as authorized, and you had to get it to conference. So, you know, there was a series of people in Congress that you had to deal with.
Okay, very good.
I think perhaps we've come a nice point to bring this to an end.
Good.
I want to thank you very much.
Enjoyed it. Thank you
on
very
behalf
much.
of the Living History Program, thank my panelists, and
Right.
been a very good interview. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.